I've discovered references to aliens that have been deliberately suppressed by authorities. I have uncovered a document which contains 102 references to aliens, all of which have since been suppressed. Who did it? NASA, the CIA, the US government? No, the NIV 2011 translators. Aliens are mentioned 102 times in the NIV 1984 translation, but every mention has been changed to foreigner in the NIV 2011. A blatant conspiracy. Well, in fact, the translators were quite right to make the change, because they pointed out that the word alien used to mean foreigner, but now it mostly means a person from outer space. And so the Bible word actually means foreigner, and so that's a correct translation into modern English. So pardon my little joke. We'll get down to issues of detail like that one in a minute, but just for now, our topic is which English Bible translation to choose. I'm sometimes asked, since I've been involved in Bible translation myself, which English Bible do you recommend? So I thought it would be good to do a little lesson here, just looking at some of the different versions, and I have a way of comparing them that's a little bit different, and I hope it'll be valuable. So let's have a look. So this diagram that I've drawn here is a way that you might have seen, comparing different English translations. One book where this is found is a book called How to Read the Bible for All It's Worth by Gordon D. Fee and Douglas Stewart. This comes from page 42 of the little paperback edition that I had of it. They actually have a few more versions than I've written here, but I didn't have the space, so I've just concentrated on the main ones. So they have the KJV, King James Version, and the NKJV, the New King James Version, written underneath it, because that's a revision of that. And they class these as formal equivalents, and the ESV is really grouped with them as well. Then they come to functional equivalents, and here we have the NIV, the Good News Bible, and the New Living Translation, which are coming more in the direction of the free translation, where we have the Living Bible and the Message. So by formal equivalents, they mean more or less word by word equivalents. Formal in the sense of form, so it's following the form as much as possible. And functional means more like following the function or the meaning. And so we'll look at some examples in a minute. Fee and Stewart say the basic translation for reading and studying should be something like the NIV, and they call the NIV as good a translation as you will get. The book was actually written before the NIV 2011 came out, but I'm sure that would get this approval from them as well. Just another comment, the GNB Good News Bible, in the US it's sometimes called the GNT, the Good News Translation. So you will see this in Fee and Stewart's book, and you'll see it in other books and presentations as well. And I acknowledge that this is good and valid, and it gives you a worthwhile insight into the translations. But I want to say that translation is a complex process, and this illustration is a simplification. It's just one way of looking at it. It doesn't actually do full justice to all the issues involved. So I'm going to present another way of looking at it, which again, I have to admit doesn't do full justice, but it gives us a little bit of insight by approaching it from a different angle. So what I'm suggesting is this: instead of looking at these versions as translations, each done in a different way, we'll consider them all as basically done in the same way, but into different languages. So, for example, the King James Version is a good translation into Elizabethan English, or we could call it King James English. The ESV is a good translation into ESV Bible English. The NIV is a good translation into NIV Bible English. And this is Good News Bible English, and so on. But the important point that first derives from this is that as we move over here, we're moving closer and closer to ordinary English. Now, I'll talk about this a bit, and I'll use different words, but they're all in the same kind of sense. I'll talk about ordinary English, plain English, or normal English. And by that I mean just the normal English that, like I'm using now as I speak, that we use just normally when we speak to our friends and families. Sure, there are slight regional variations, but I'm just talking about the basic core of normal standard English as understood by native speakers of English all around the world. So let me write this here. Over here we have Bible English, and over here we're getting towards like normal English, and I'm suggesting that this is an alternative way to look at these different versions, and we'll look at some examples shortly. Now, for the purposes of this talk, I'm going to concentrate on this one and on this one. So the NIV as a representative of Bible English, and the Good News Bible as a good representative of normal English. But bear in mind that I'm not wanting to raise a criticism of any of these versions or to say that they're bad, but what I'm pointing out is that the NIV is translated into a slightly different form of English. NIV Bible English is very close to normal English, but it's not quite the same. And now Good News Bible English is very close to normal English, and so it's quite valuable to look at these two versions and compare how they've dealt with different examples. Our first example comes from the Old Testament book of Numbers 11:23, and in the NIV we read, "Is the Lord's arm too short?" Now, in normal English, to say someone's arm is short means he's in trouble at the dinner table. In Urupi, incidentally, the language that I worked in Vanuatu, it would mean he's short of cash. So evidently it means something different in NIV Bible English. But what? So you might want to pause the video here and have a think about it. What does this expression, which is an expression in NIV Bible English, what does it mean if you translated this into normal English? What does it mean? What is it saying? Obviously it's not saying that the Lord's arm is physically short. So what is it actually saying? Well, if we go to the Good News Bible, here we have it in Good News Bible English, which, as I said, is pretty much the same as normal English. Is there a limit to my power? So here we have it in Bible English, and here we have it in normal English. Is there a limit to my power? Now, you may have heard people say, use Bibles like the Good News Bible for reading, or for devotional reading, but for serious study, use a Bible like the NIV or the ESV. But seen in the perspective that we're taking in this little talk, what you're really doing when you study the NIV or ESV is that you're learning a different language. In order to understand the NIV, you must learn the language called NIV Bible English in order to understand what it's saying. So I would challenge that suggestion that you need to use a Bible like the NIV as a study Bible, because I say when you're doing your study from the NIV, in effect, what you're doing is you're learning a different language. And it can be quite confusing because you can never really be sure when NIV Bible English is going to be the same as normal English and when it's not. It can be quite tricky to determine. Let's go to another example. Jeremiah chapter 19 verse 3. The ears of everyone who hears of it will tingle. This is interesting because, like the previous example, it sounds like normal English. All the words are English, so we assume it's normal English and try to make sense of it. Does it mean perhaps that they sense someone is talking about them? Or does it mean they've got ringing in their ears? Or does it mean they've got frostbite or something? Well, actually, it doesn't mean anything in normal English because it's simply not an expression we use in English. Well, I asked people, someone told me they'd use it, but I've never used it. To me, it's like writing blonde. I mean, if I wrote blonde, you might say, well, what does that mean? It looks like an English word. All the letters are English letters. So what is it supposed to mean? Maybe it means blunt. Does it mean blunt? Or does it maybe mean blind? It kind of looks like English, and so we try to make sense of it. But really, unless we've got a context to guide us, we can't make sense of it because it's not actually a word that we use in normal English. And I suggest, in my dialect of English anyway, that this is exactly the same category. All the words are English, so it looks like an English expression, but we really don't have a hope of understanding it because it's not an expression we use in normal English, and the only way we can make sense of it is if the context will point to the meaning. The context has to tell us what it's supposed to mean. So again, I'll suggest that you pause the video and have a think about it. Try to figure out what you think it means. Bear in mind that this is NIV Bible English. This is not normal English. Okay, so let's now look at the Good News Bible to see what it might mean in normal English. Everyone who hears about it will be stunned. So now we understand because there it is in plain normal English. So here we see the difficulty with NIV Bible English because it looks like plain and normal English, so we assume at first that it is just plain and normal English, but it diverges without warning from normal English. The context might lead us to suspect that the meaning is different from what it appears to be, if understood as normal English. So if we remember that we're dealing with a different dialect of English, we can try and figure out what it's supposed to mean. Maybe we can work it out from the context, or maybe we can use the help of the NIV Study Bible, which is a very good reference. But I say, why not just use Bibles that say it in plain English in the first place? And I mean, well, what is NIV Bible English? Is there any way to predict when it will deviate from normal English? I've thought about this quite a bit. It seems the best we can say is that any expression that's become known from the King James Version is a likely candidate for inclusion in NIV Bible English, but not invariably. And also I should say Christians hear and use Bible English. We use it when we speak, and we use it in popular Christian songs still today, and so we're familiar with it. But if we're familiar with it, doesn't necessarily mean that we understand it. That's not necessarily the same thing, being familiar with it and understanding it. So let's come down again to Exodus 32 verse 9. They are a stiff-necked people. So what does this mean? Well, it's all normal English words again, but in this case it does have a clear meaning in normal English. And the meaning is, they've got some physical problem with their necks. But the alert reader will see that this doesn't seem to fit the context, and so he or she will suspect that again, here we have an NIV Bible English expression that has a different meaning. So again, you might want to pause the video and think about it for yourself. What does this mean? How would you say it in normal English? And reliably, we could turn to the Good News Bible, which tells us they are stubborn. That's what it means. They are stubborn. Now, just another comment here. Some of you watching this video, assuming anybody bothers to watch it, will say, when you look at the Good News Bible, you say, that's not what it means. And this is a common reaction that people have who are perhaps used to their King James Version or the ESV or the NIV, and they look at something like the Good News Bible and they say, that's not what it means. But I suggest that is what it means. Because the Good News Bible, like the NIV, is an accurate translation. You don't find mistakes in either of these versions. You don't find mistakes. But the reason for the difference is that the NIV Bible English is a slightly different dialect of English to the Good News Bible English, and that's why the different expression, the different wording seems to be entirely different wording. At first blush it seems to be saying an entirely different thing, but you've got to realize that this is NIV Bible English, this is how you say it in NIV Bible English, and this is how you say it in Good News Bible English, which is pretty much plain English. So these are both accurate translations. You can't say that this is wrong or this is wrong. They're both correct. And if anybody from their understanding of NIV Bible English thinks that this is wrong, I would suggest what you need to check is not the Good News Bible, but your own understanding of NIV Bible English. Now, I've been quoting the Good News Bible for normal English renderings, but I'd like to say just a word here about the CEV, the Contemporary English Version, and the NLT, the New Living Translation. The CEV is similar to the Good News Bible, but in some ways it's a more thoroughgoing application of the Good News Bible method. It's well worth a look. So that's the CEV, Contemporary English Version. It's in the same kind of category as the Good News Bible. And the NLT, as in my diagram, goes a little bit further over here. It's actually a carefully done revision of the LB, the Living Bible. So we could write that up there. It tends to be a bit more likely than the CEV or Good News Bible to use Bible English, but it's also often better at the vivid action scene. Bible English, a disadvantage of Bible English is that it often makes it sound like the action is taking place in a stained glass window. Now, where do we have it here? Yes, let's look at 1 Samuel 19:10. I'll turn this around. In the NIV, we read, Saul tried to pin him to the wall with his spear, but David eluded him as Saul drove the spear into the wall. That night David made good his escape. So this is NIV Bible English, which as frequently is characterized by a pretty good vocabulary. That's certainly an advantage of it. More literary terms. Which incidentally leads to another thing that people sometimes say. They say, oh, the Good News Bible is just for children. It's just for people with low reading ability. But go to a version like the NIV for adult type reading. Well, that's true. So the NIV does often use good literary English terms like this one. But I dispute that the Good News Bible is just for children. Sure, it uses not quite such a wide vocabulary, but the main difference, as I'm saying, is that they're in actually a different dialect. But look at this. Tried to pin him to the wall. Okay, well, I mean, that sounds like these figures that are being pinned to the pinboard in a Sunday school lesson. But David eluded him. It all sounds like it's a little bit kind of distant. Saul drove the spear into the wall. Why did Saul drive the spear into the wall? That night David made good his escape. So, okay, well, that's quite good expression. But let's see what the NLT says. Saul hurled his spear at David. To me, that's much better at capturing the action. Saul hurled his spear at David, but David dodged out of the way, leaving the spear stuck in the wall. He fled and escaped into the night. To me, that's much better in getting the action. I would personally go a little bit further. Saul hurled his spear at David. David ducked, and the spear thudded into the wall. That's just getting the action a little bit better. But to me, I don't know, maybe you think I'm being a bit harsh, but to me, this makes it look a little bit like it all happened in a book, or all happened in a stained glass window. Okay, there we are. Now, just a word about the King James Version here. In its time, it was a very good translation, although even in 1611 the English in it was a little bit old-fashioned. And English has changed a lot since then, and it's now quite hard to understand in places. But to my mind, a very unfortunate thing about using it today is that it gives the impression that Christianity is something for a past generation and not for the present. This is ironic because in some ways it was quite progressive. In fact, it does some things that even modern translators wouldn't dare to do. For example, they partly shifted the whole context of the Bible from ancient Palestine to 17th century England by making cultural replacements. Lamps became candles, and lampstands became candlesticks. Wineskins became bottles, and sandals became shoes. They opened books instead of unrolling scrolls, and ointment was kept in boxes, not flasks. Good modern versions don't take liberties like that. And also, it was a little bit inconsistent, which is a characteristic of early translations. In Matthew 27:44, it says, "The thieves who were crucified with him," that's Jesus, "cast the same in his teeth." Now, what's this cast the same in his teeth? In fact, the Greek says nothing like that. What they're doing here is something that King James advocates criticize in modern versions. They've completely left the Greek to make a good translation into Elizabethan English at the time. Cast it in his teeth means that you really give someone a strong telling off. Cast it in his teeth. They abuse him. And but the interesting thing is that when you come to the gospel parallel, in Mark's gospel, where exactly the same incident is recounted in exactly the same Greek words, the King James Version says, "The thieves who were crucified with him reviled him." So isn't that interesting? Cast the same in his teeth just becomes reviled him, which is closer to a word-by-word translation of what the Greek said. So it's interesting variation, as we see in the King James Version, from this wonderfully expressive Elizabethan English idiom to a pretty much word-by-word following of the Greek, probably done by different groups, because the translators divided themselves up into different groups when they did the translation work. So there we have it. We could call this normal expressive Elizabethan English, and this is more like Bible English. Reviled him because it's following the Greek pretty much word for word. So now just a word about the NKJV, the New King James Version. It's fixed these issues and it's updated the language quite a bit. So their target language could be described as somewhat modernized King James Version English. So if you like that language and if you understand it properly, then okay, you can use this version. We could make an analogy here. Using the King James Version is like driving around in a Model T Ford. People like Model T Fords for various reasons, maybe nostalgia or sentimental reasons, or maybe a hobby interest. But no one can argue that a Model T Ford is the best way to get where you need to go. So in the same way, people use the King James Version for various reasons, maybe sentimental reasons, maybe they were brought up with it, but it's not the best way to get a good understanding of what the Bible is saying. And the NKJV is like a Model T Ford with some, but not all, features and components modernized. So it retains a certain amount of the sentimental value, but with it some of the motoring disadvantages compared to a good modern car built without these unnecessary restraints. Now, I also want to say that new translations have always had a hard time being accepted. Even the King James Bible took a while to become accepted. It's interesting to look at the reception of more recent translations. So the NIV first came out in 1978, and unusually among translations it did get a pretty good reception right from the start. But a revision of the NIV came out in 2005 called the TNIV, today's NIV, and that got quite a bit of criticism and led to mass defections from the NIV because it introduced the so-called gender-neutral language, which a lot of people had strong objections to. For example, instead of saying brothers, it would say brothers and sisters, and instead of saying he, they might say they. And instead of saying sons of God, it might say children of God. The most recent one is the NIV 2011, which retreated a little bit from this gender-neutral language, but failed to lure back most of the defectors. The Good News Bible came out first in 1976. It was first called the TEV, today's English version, and it caused a huge storm in certain circles by what they called losing the blood. So there were some cases where blood was no longer translated blood. For example, the blood of Christ might be changed to the death of Christ or the sacrificial death of Christ. The thing is here, the English word blood normally just means the stuff that comes out when you cut yourself, but the Bible word blood has a much broader meaning area where sometimes it does mean death or sacrificial death or even guilt for death. So the Good News Bible translators, whose job was to translate this into normal English, I think with full justification, occasionally replaced blood by something like sacrificial death. But the NIV used the word blood, and it's like the King James Bible in its Bible English sense, which is different from its normal English sense. So that's why the Good News Bible couldn't use the word blood in some cases where it actually meant sacrificial death, because the Good News Bible is a translation into normal English. And yeah, we could give other examples, but the RSV in 1952 caused a huge storm by using young woman instead of virgin in Isaiah 7:14. And going back further, the RV, the Revised Version in the 1880s, caused a huge storm by using love in 1 Corinthians 13 in place of the King James Version's charity. In each case, I think it's fair to say that the negative reaction is based more on emotional attachment to the old version than on a careful and informed consideration of the issues. So, a little bit more then about the NIV 2011. It is a careful revision of earlier NIV versions, and it has undoubted improvements and undeniable value. It's well worth looking at it, but you have to remember, whenever you look at it, that it's in Bible English. And so to benefit from it, you need a very accurate understanding of Bible English. Here's another example, where NIV 1984 sometimes said sinful nature, the NIV 2011 often goes back to flesh. For example, you can see this in Romans 8:5. Romans 8:5 for one example. Now, we do use the word flesh in normal English, but nothing like the meaning that it has in Bible English. So, like I say, the NIV 2011 is an excellent translation. It's well worth looking at, but in order to benefit from it, you need to have a good understanding of NIV Bible English. And I want to say in conclusion that it's crucial to have our faith expressed in our plain mother tongue. This is both for our own understanding and also so we can communicate it to others. Understanding something and hearing it or expressing it in your mother tongue is one and the same thing. You cannot fully understand something until you hear it expressed in your mother tongue. Or even better understanding, I could say you cannot fully understand something until you express it yourself in your mother tongue. Nor can we expect other people to understand us unless we give them the message in plain English. That's why we need Bibles that speak to us in plain English, and that's why I strongly advocate the Good News Bible. Similar to it, we have the CEV, also well worth a look, and similar to it also is the NLT. And I'll talk just a little bit more about those in a minute, but first I just want to show you this, which is the bibliography, the most important books. This is the one I referred to at the beginning, How to Read the Bible for All It's Worth. And this is a Bible Translator magazine put out by the Bible Society. By the way, I don't belong to the Bible Society myself, so it's not a self-interested plug, but this is a very good source of all kinds of information about Bible translation. And here's an article. In this article in particular, these are available free on the internet. And you can also read more on my blog, which is logosword.wordpress.com. So just in conclusion, then we come back to this diagram, and we have Bible English going in this direction and normal English coming in this direction. In fact, we could say the message kind of overshoots it. The message, we could say, is perhaps 90s US urban lingo. So it perhaps overshoots standard normal English a little bit. But with the Good News Bible here, I'd like to add the CEV, the Contemporary English Version, as well as the NLT. And the Old Living Bible, which came out in the 60s, is very popular, and it's actually quite similar to the Passion Translation, which has just come out recently and proven quite popular. very similar kind of style. Just to point out that these ones in particular, although they're in the normal English range, they tend to mix in a little bit, just a few Bible English terms, so you've got to be a little bit careful of them, and that's perhaps why I put my main recommendation on this one here. It's really pretty hard to go beyond it. It's quite popular in New Zealand and Australia. I don't think it's so popular in other parts of the English speaking world, but to me this is underused. This version is grossly underused. It should be used by Christians a lot more, and it's also unfairly denigrated. People say things it's like Bible for babies or dumbed down for kids, but in fact it only appears to be so because it's in plain normal English. And along the same lines, the CEV is well worth looking at along with the NLT, because getting the message in plain normal English is essential for us to understand it, and essential for us to communicate this message to the world of people who aren't Christians and who have no familiarity with Bible English.